February 20th, 1944. Truk Lagoon, Caroline Islands. Mid-morning. The tropical sun hung oppressively in the sky, bleaching the waves to silver as the launch engines sputtered toward the ruined docks. Vice Admiral Jisaburō Ozawa stood stiffly at the bow, his gloved hand gripping the rail, eyes narrowed beneath the peak of his cap. The scent of salt air was laced with something darker: smoke, scorched rubber, and aviation fuel. The launch drew closer. The once proud stronghold of the Imperial Japanese Navy, nicknamed the Gibraltar of the Pacific, was unrecognizable. Hulks of seaplanes bobbed in the shallows like shattered bones. Gantries lay twisted like broken cranes. The repair slips were silent. Smoke coiled from the wreckage of the supply depot, where only hours ago, barrels of avgas and crates of spare aircraft parts had ignited under American bombs. Ozawa's boots touched the scarred pier with a metallic thud. He was flanked by staff officers, but none spoke. Not here. Not now. The silence was broken only by the distant crackle of still smoldering fuel stores and the whine of cicadas in the treetops. Truk Lagoon had been the centerpiece of Japanese naval projection in the South Pacific. It was supposed to be impregnable. Now, its defenses had been ripped apart in less than 2 days. As they moved inland, the devastation deepened. Craters chewed through the runways in jagged rows. Ground crews combed the wreckage, blackened faces streaked with oil and ash. Ozawa paused before the husk of a Mitsubishi A6M0, its fuselage crumpled, the wings torn away. A maintenance officer saluted with trembling fingers. "We have no more reserve airframes," he reported. 90% of our fuel stores were destroyed. Hangars collapsed. Power grid is gone." Ozawa said nothing. His gaze lingered on the twisted remains of a Nakajima BIE-10 torpedo bomber, its engine embedded in a tree trunk. That aircraft had once flown from the decks of Shikaku and Zuikaku, delivering death at Pearl Harbor. Now it was rusting in a puddle of its own oil. The real blow came when he reached the main aviation repair depot. The bomb craters were so wide and deep, they swallowed entire trucks. Beneath the collapsed roof, melted tool racks, burned-out generators, and cracked hydraulic presses told the rest of the story. This had been the heart of the carrier fleet's lifeblood, where planes were serviced, rebuilt, and made battle-ready. Now it was rubble. Rear Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, overseeing the inspection tour, stepped forward. His voice was quiet. "Admiral, we lost more than fuel and aircraft. We lost our logistics capability. It will take months to restore even basic functionality." Ozawa turned slowly, his face drawn. "And the mechanics?" Fukudome shook his head. "Many were killed. The survivors are too few. We can't rebuild here." A sudden gust of wind lifted a singed flight log from the blackened ground. Ozawa caught it, instinctively. The paper was brittle with heat. Names, serial numbers, and sortie notes fluttered in his hands like eulogies. He looked up. Beyond the shattered airstrip, the lagoon sparkled deceptively, its turquoise waters concealing dozens of wrecks beneath the surface. Transports, oilers, and light cruisers lay torn open below, resting in watery graves. From the air, American pilots had called the scene a turkey shoot. For the Japanese, it was a culling. The truth struck with the weight of iron. Without Truk, Japan's carrier fleet had no lungs, no arteries. There would be no fuel to sortie, no parts to repair battle damage, no technicians to prepare strike packages. The great floating fortresses, Taiho, Shinano, Zuikaku were now majestic corpses waiting for the final blow. Ozawa turned away, the flight log still clutched in his hand. The Empire had lost more than a base. It had lost the war behind the war. February 17th, 1944. Truk Lagoon, pre-dawn hours. The first vibration was barely felt, just a distant rumble beneath the feet of night watchmen posted along the inner docks. Some thought it was another supply barge docking late. Others dismissed it as tropical thunder. But within minutes, the low tremble became a rising roar. Then, tracer fire arced overhead, and the sky ignited. Admiral Masami Kobayashi, commander of the 4th Fleet stationed at Truk, was jolted awake by a staff officer pounding on the door of his quarters. "Sir, enemy planes, multiple waves. American carriers are off the northeast." Within minutes, the air raid sirens wailed, but they were almost drowned out by the thunder of engines. F-6F Hellcats slashed through the morning clouds, followed by wave after wave of SBD Dauntless dive bombers and TBF Avenger torpedo planes. Operation Hailstone had begun. The USS Enterprise, Intrepid, Essex, and Yorktown launched more than 4,000 uninterrupted sorties in the first day alone. Carrier Task Force 58, commanded by Admiral Mark Mitcher, had moved in under radio silence, striking with surgical precision and overwhelming force. The Japanese had no early warning system, no long-range radar. It was a slaughter. By mid-morning, the fuel depots were engulfed in firestorms. Black columns of smoke billowed into the sky as torpedoes turned oilers and tankers into floating infernos. Ammunition dumps exploded with concussive force, shattering windows and hurling debris across the island. At the main airstrip, aircraft scrambled to take off, Zeros, Vals, and Jills, but they were picked off as they lifted from the runway. Maintenance crews, armed with rifles and pistols, fired desperately at the streaking shadows above. The defenders were outnumbered, outgunned, and outflown. Lieutenant Satoshi Maruyama, a 22-year-old Zero pilot, managed to lift off from the cratered strip. He climbed hard, heart pounding, sweat pooling under his flight goggles. But before he could find altitude, a pair of F-6Fs dropped in behind him. His engine screamed. He tried to bank into a tight turn, but the American plane stayed glued to his 6. In under 20 seconds, his Zero exploded in a burst of flame and aluminum shards. His final scream vanished into the sky. By nightfall, Truk's defenses were crippled. More than 40 ships had been sunk or rendered inoperable, including 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers. Aircraft losses were catastrophic. Nearly 300 planes destroyed, most of them on the ground. The lagoon floor became a steel graveyard, littered with burning hulks and leaking oil. Even as darkness fell, the attack didn't stop. American Avengers flew night bombing runs, guided by ship-mounted radar. Every remaining fuel tank, ammo bunker, and radio mast was targeted. Anti-aircraft guns blazed sporadically, lighting up the jungle in flashes of defiance. But it was hopeless. The next morning, as the sun broke through the scorched canopy, a ghastly silence settled over Truk. Fires still smoldered in hangars and barracks. Blackened bodies lay in the open. The acrid stink of burned aviation oil clung to everything. What had been the beating heart of Japan's naval air arm was now a smoking carcass. Admiral Kobayashi, hunched in the bombed-out command post, removed his cap and set it down on the cracked table. "We have nothing left to defend this base," he muttered. His staff, bloodied and exhausted, said nothing. It would take another day before the full scale of destruction could be assessed, but by then, it was already too late. The Empire's carriers, scattered across the Central Pacific, were now alone. The vast logistics pipeline that fed them, from spare engines to aviation gasoline, had been severed in a matter of 36 hours. And that truth, when it finally reached Admiral Ozawa, hit harder than any bomb. March 1944. Saipan Naval Air Command. The fluorescent lights in the operations room flickered as Admiral Jisaburō Ozawa traced his finger across a map of the Central Pacific. Pins and markers showed the current positions of Japan's remaining carriers: Zuikaku, Taiho, Shokaku, Unryu. They were still afloat, still seaworthy, still dangerous on paper. But Ozawa now saw them for what they were: empty hulls without lungs. The loss of Truk had severed the Empire's ability to project sustained air power. Every Japanese aircraft carrier depended on an intricate support system: parts flown in from mainland factories, fuel routed through tanker convoys, specialized mechanics trained in the nuances of aircraft repair, and facilities capable of rebuilding aircraft damaged in combat. All of that had been centered at Truk. And now, it was gone. From the corner of the room, a communications officer approached and bowed. "Sir, intelligence from Combined Fleet Headquarters. Tanker Shinkoku Maru was sunk en route to Palau. Only one survivor. No fuel delivery will be made." Ozawa clenched his jaw. That made 4 tankers in 2 weeks. The Americans were not just destroying ships. They were dismantling the bloodstream of Japan's war machine. Across the room, another officer flipped through aircraft readiness reports. Of the air groups assigned to the First Mobile Fleet, less than 30% were operational. There were pilots but no replacement aircraft, mechanics but no tools. Fuel gauges stayed stubbornly near empty. Even the few airframes salvaged from Hailstone's aftermath were of limited use. Many had suffered heat damage from nearby fires, or were missing vital components scavenged from other wrecks. "Hangar queens," one ground officer called them, planes that would never fly again. Ozawa took the latest fleet readiness report into his private office. He read it in silence. His command had once included hundreds of aircraft and dozens of carriers. Now, he couldn't guarantee that a single carrier could launch more than a handful of planes in combat. He looked out the window toward the harbor. Taiho, Japan's newest and most advanced fleet carrier, was moored in the bay, her sleek lines sharp against the setting sun. She looked formidable: an armored flight deck, new arrestor gear, improved aircraft elevators. But Ozawa knew the truth. Without fuel and without supply chains, Taiho might as well be a museum ship. Every sortie would be a gamble. Every torpedo run would mean precious fuel lost. Every pilot lost was irreplaceable. Japan was still building carriers, but they were building them faster than they could fill their decks. Back in the main operations center, reports continued to come in. American submarines were now prowling shipping lanes near Formosa and the Marianas. A new B-29 base had become operational in the Gilberts. Ozawa didn't need a strategist to tell him what was coming. The Americans had cracked the code. They no longer needed to engage in massive fleet battles to destroy the Japanese Navy. They only had to sever its arteries, fuel lines, airfields, repair hubs, and watch the mighty war machine die from within. Ozawa picked up his pen and began drafting a report to the Naval General Staff in Tokyo. His words were careful, restrained, but unmistakably grim. "The destruction of Truk has rendered sustained carrier operations in the Central Pacific untenable. Immediate reevaluation of fleet doctrine and logistics is required. Without an alternative forward base and secured fuel supply, the first mobile fleet cannot be expected to fulfill its strategic obligations. He paused, lowered the pen, and stared at the map again. The carriers were still afloat, but their days were numbered. Tokyo Naval Ministry, April 1944. In a chamber lit by pale sunlight filtering through shoji screens, the silence was strained. Senior officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy sat at a long lacquered table, their uniforms crisp, their expressions grim. At the head sat Admiral Osami Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff. His fingers steepled under his chin. Vice Admiral Ozawa stood before them, his report bound in rice paper, spine worn from sleepless revisions. The document detailed more than the physical loss of Truk. It revealed the spiritual collapse of the carrier doctrine Japan had once pioneered with precision and daring. The first mobile fleet, Ozawa began, voice low but steady, was designed for decisive engagement. But we now lack the logistical depth to support it. A murmur swept through the room. The doctrine of Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle, had guided Japanese naval strategy for decades. It envisioned drawing the U.S. Navy into a single titanic engagement where Japan's superior tactics and aggression would deliver a crippling blow. Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Midway had all been gambles in pursuit of that vision. But with the destruction of Truk's infrastructure, that dream had turned to smoke. Without a functioning forward base, Ozawa continued, our carriers cannot refuel, cannot repair, cannot replenish aircraft. We have lost not only materiel, but the means to sustain fleet aviation at all. Rear Admiral Teijiro Toyota frowned. What of Palau? Saipan? Couldn't we shift logistics there? Ozawa shook his head. Palau is vulnerable and lacks facilities. Saipan is too far forward. Every transfer exposes convoys to submarine attack. We are bleeding out. One staff officer, Captain Yamashita, leaned forward. Then what do we have left? The question hung in the air. No one answered. The Americans had redefined naval warfare. Their island-hopping campaign bypassed strongholds and turned them into isolated tombs. Their submarines choked Japanese shipping lanes. Their carriers operated with air groups larger than full land-based squadrons, supported by mobile replenishment fleets, oilers, repair ships, supply vessels, an innovation Japan never fully adopted. Ozawa exhaled, his voice softer now. We built the sword, but we forgot the hand to wield it. Outside the ministry, Tokyo's streets bustled with civilians, unaware that the foundations of Japan's naval power had cracked. Posters still called for victory in the Pacific. Students marched in drill lines. Radio programs played marches. But inside the war rooms, a different rhythm beat. One of desperation and resignation. Plans to rebuild Truk were quietly shelved. Resources were redirected to homeland defense. New carrier construction orders, like Shinano, continued, but there were no illusions. These ships would sail into a future where they could not be supported. In secret meetings, senior admirals began to speak openly of conserving what little remained. Some, like Admiral Yamamoto before his death, had warned that war with America was a gamble Japan could not sustain. Others still clung to hope that a miracle blow, a Midway in reverse, might yet change the tide. But Ozawa knew better. He had walked the scorched hangars of Truk. He had smelled the burned oil and seen the ash-covered corpses of mechanics who once kept Japan's air wings flying. He had stood on the decks of carriers with empty hangars and rusting catapults. The fleet was not yet sunk, but it was already dying. He bowed to the assembled officers, delivered his report, and left without a word. In the hallway, the low murmur of young naval cadets echoed from a nearby classroom. They were learning carrier tactics, flight deck coordination, sortie wave timing, flak suppression techniques, all the tools of a bygone age. Ozawa didn't stop to listen. He knew they were studying ghosts. June 19th, 1944. Philippine Sea, west of the Mariana Islands. The horizon shimmered in the blistering heat. Aboard the Taiho, Japan's flagship supercarrier, Vice Admiral Ozawa stood on the command platform, scanning the eastern sky. Below him, the flight deck hummed with activity. Deck crews signaling, aircraft engines throttling, propellers biting into the wind. The fleet's remaining carriers, Zuikaku, Shokaku, Junyo, Hyo, lined the seas like iron islands. Operation Ego was underway. The objective: destroy the American invasion fleet approaching Saipan. It would be the largest carrier engagement of the war. But Ozawa knew this was no midway. His fleet was a shadow of its former self. From his vantage, everything appeared precise. Pilots rushed to their aircraft, A6M50s, Yokosuka D4Y, Judy dive bombers, Nakajima B6N JIL torpedo planes. But only half of the flight decks were full. The other half stood conspicuously empty. Aircraft production had never recovered from the loss of Truk. The pilots, many barely out of training, wore expressions of nervous resolve. Some had logged fewer than 20 hours of flight time. Worse still, many air crews had trained on different planes and only recently transitioned to carrier operations. There had been no time for full carrier qualification. Ozawa watched one pilot stumble as he climbed into his cockpit. A young ensign fumbled with his harness. There was no veteran to correct him. They were all gone. As the first wave launched, the skies above filled with the thunder of radial engines. Ozawa clenched the railing. His orders had been clear: strike hard, destroy the American flat tops, and halt the invasion. But the Americans were waiting, from over 200 miles away. Radar-guided Hellcats from Task Force 58 intercepted the Japanese strike groups. The result was immediate and devastating. Veteran American pilots tore through the formations with cold precision. Zeros burst into fireballs. Bombers plunged helplessly into the sea. It was not a battle. It was an execution. The Americans would later call it the Great Mariana's Turkey Shoot. By mid-afternoon, nearly every aircraft Ozawa had launched was gone. Survivors trickled back, some with wounded co-pilots, others crash landing on the decks. Many simply vanished into the ocean. The Shokaku was struck by torpedoes from the submarine USS Kavala and went down in less than 10 minutes, taking over 1,200 sailors with her. And then came the blow that shattered any illusion of recovery. A sudden deep shudder rolled through the Taiho. The bridge quivered. Alarms shrieked. A muffled explosion echoed up from below decks. Ozawa turned sharply as damage control officers rushed in. "Enemy submarine!" one shouted. "Torpedo hit starboard side! Fuel vapors igniting in hangar!" Fire raced through the internal corridors. The armored flight deck, once considered a revolutionary defense, trapped the heat and blast within. Within hours, Taiho, pride of the fleet, was burning from bow to stern. By nightfall, she sank, taking Ozawa's command staff and hundreds of crew with her. Ozawa survived, plucked from the sea by a destroyer. As he was helped aboard, soaked in oil, smoke blackened, he looked back to where Taiho had slipped beneath the waves. It was over. Of the 9 Japanese carriers present at the battle, 3 were sunk, and hundreds of planes were lost. Most pilots who did make it back never flew again. Japan had thrown the last of its trained carrier air power into the Philippine Sea, and the Americans had shredded it in a single day. In Tokyo, news of the disaster was concealed from the public. The ministry spoke only of gallant resistance, but in the war rooms, everyone understood what had happened. Without Truk's logistics, without the backbone of maintenance, resupply, and training, the fleet had stood no chance. Ozawa, silent on the return voyage, wrote in his diary, "We took our carriers into battle, but the wings had already been broken long ago. What flew today were the ashes of our former strength." August 1944. Truk Lagoon, now abandoned by Japan's front-line command. The water lapped gently against coral-strewn beaches. A humid wind rustled through coconut palms, growing unchecked among shattered bunkers. Crabs skittered across empty ammunition crates. The once mighty Japanese naval fortress had been reduced to an overgrown skeleton, haunted by silence and decay. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Aikawa, one of the few remaining officers assigned to salvage detail, walked alone through the skeletal frame of what had once been the central maintenance hangar. His boots crunched on glass and charred steel. A moss-covered Zero lay on its side, its propeller buried in the dirt. The rising sun insignia faded to ghostly blotches. The cratered airstrip was unusable. Barracks and storage sheds had collapsed in the tropical heat, their wooden beams rotting, their roofs punched through by rain and age. Aikawa moved quietly past the wreck of a supply truck, its cargo spilled and scavenged by nature. Vines grew up through its engine block like arteries. He was not here for war anymore. He was here to document, to gather what could be used, to record the loss. A small team of engineers followed him, cataloging components, bent propellers, corroded radios, scorched engine blocks. They knew most of it was useless. The logistics chain to the outer islands had been severed since the spring. No convoys arrived. No fuel was offloaded. Truk was no longer even resupplied by air. It was a ghost port. At the harbor's edge, the water shimmered a brilliant aquamarine. But below the surface, hulks of Japanese ships sat rotting on the seabed. Tankers like the Fujikawa Maru, troop transports like San Francisco Maru, destroyers and tugs, all swallowed by the lagoon. Their rusted hulls leaked oil and memory. Fish darted through open hatches. Coral bloomed along torpedo holes. To Aikawa, it was a graveyard. He looked out toward the sunken mooring towers, their steel frames poking through the sea like rusted bones. Once, they had supported the greatest naval force Japan had ever assembled. Once, they had held fast the carriers that thundered across the Pacific. Now, they held only silence. He turned back toward the jungle path, where faded signs still pointed toward bombed-out fuel depots and shattered air raid shelters. A barely legible message was painted on the wall of an old command shack. For the Emperor, we endure. But there was no enduring here. Back in Tokyo, strategic attention had moved to the home islands. Naval planners focused on defending Okinawa, Kyushu, and the inner defense ring. Truk had been effectively written off. Its remaining garrison was left to wither. No fuel, no aircraft, no mission. Ozawa would never return. The admiral had been reassigned, his voice quiet. his reports carefully redacted to avoid disturbing morale. In private circles, he spoke of the war's end not as an outcome, but as a certainty. When asked about Truk, he would only say, "We buried the Empire's future beneath that water." Years later, after Japan's surrender, American divers would descend into the lagoon to explore the wreckage. They would find preserved uniforms in lockers, ammunition still packed in crates, bone fragments in rusted turrets. The ships would remain, unrazed, untouched, monuments to a turning point that came not in one battle, but in a failure of logistics, of foresight, of time. And, as they explored, they would find something else. Unopened toolkits on the decks of sunken repair ships. Maintenance logs scorched black, but still legible. Evidence of a war effort that had tried to survive, but was smothered before it ever had the chance. Truk Lagoon did not die in a single day. It died slowly, quietly, and with it, the carrier fleet it once sustained.